The lights flickered, almost as if the old generator knew how fatal its failure could be that night. Thomas Burke, a lone meteorologist, adjusted the thermometer inside his monitoring station atop Alaska's isolated Brooks Range. Biting winds howled like hungry wolves outside, and the thermometer read an incredible -50 degrees Celsius. In that corner of the world, heat was a precious commodity, and Thomas knew how to preserve every centigrade his rickety fireplace could generate. And before we continue with this intriguing story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. This helps us bring more content like this to you. Now, let's get back to the story. His routine was mostly the same, sending daily reports on extreme weather conditions to the base in Anchorage, and every now and then combating his loneliness with an old radio. What made the night special was a sound, not the sound of wind, frozen trees, or ice cracking under pressure. It was a low, metallic noise, like a deep wail coming from the storm outside. Thomas froze, this time not because of the cold. He dropped the coffee mug onto the wooden floor, where it shattered into pieces. The sound was closer, almost echoing between the walls of the small station. He rushed to check the outdoor cameras installed weeks earlier after noticing human footprints, unusual for the remote location. Thomas had attributed it to a lost hunter or a mad wanderer. But now the footprints seemed bigger, in humans. On the monitor, a white figure moved with impossible speed through the snow. It wasn't a polar bear. The creature was tall, perhaps 7 feet or more, and its shape was vaguely humanoid, with long arms and something that seemed to glow for eyes. Thomas was mesmerized as the figure disappeared, leaving behind a trail of burnt ice, as if sucking the heat from the air itself. Minutes later, Thomas heard a knock on the door. Weak at first, but persistent. Against all logic, it opened a crack. On the other side, a thin man lay in the snow, shivering uncontrollably. The stranger's pale skin was almost translucent, and his eyes flickered between despair and unconsciousness. "Help, please," he murmured in a faint voice. Thomas pulled him inside and laid him down by the fireplace, covering him with whatever he could. This felt like the closest Thomas had ever come to saving a life. The man seemed to be regaining consciousness when suddenly his eyes snapped open, locking onto Thomas. There was nothing human about that expression. "You are hot," said the stranger, his voice echoing in surreal tones. Suddenly, the temperature of the room dropped even further. Thomas felt the heat leave his own body as if he were being sucked away. The thin man began to stand up, but his form seemed to change, his fingers lengthening into claws, while his face lost human features. Thomas stumbled back, unable to believe his eyes. Thomas didn't know how his mind still worked in the face of the absolute terror that dominated his small station. He grabbed a fireplace poker as if it were a weapon, but the object shook in his hands. The stranger, or whatever that thing was, didn't seem to care. Every movement he made seemed to suck even more heat from the air, creating a layer of ice on the walls, the floor, even the fireplace that seconds before had been lit. "What are you?" Thomas asked, his voice coming out like a shaky scream. The creature tilted its head, a strangely human gesture, but his eyes, bright and empty, were anything but. "The heat feeds me. You have it." The voice did not come from the creature's mouth. It seemed to echo directly in Thomas's mind, like a deep metallic sound that reverberated in his soul. He didn't know if it was his imagination, but fear forced him to retreat to the work table, behind him a pile of tools. He picked up a wrench and threw it towards the being. It was useless. The creature didn't even move as the object passed through it, hitting the far wall with a loud bang. But something happened. For a brief moment, the humanoid's form wavered, like a flame about to go out. The wrench was still covered in ice when Thomas took it back, but he realized that the creature's hesitant movement meant one thing: it could be vulnerable. The humanoid advanced, and instinct took over Thomas. He darted out of the small living space and into the attached storage room, an area filled with fuel tanks and old tools. The problem, the place was even colder. With each step, he felt his bones as if they were breaking. Each breath was a gigantic effort. As Thomas hid among the shelves, his thoughts raced. Where did that come from? How did it get here? He remembered the strange sound he heard days ago, something like ice rubbing against metal. Was he watching me the whole time? Suddenly, the humanoid appeared at the entrance of the warehouse. The dim light of the place illuminated its translucent form, now completely solid. It seemed to be made of pure ice, but with elongated and grotesque features, as if someone had stretched a human body to the limits of the impossible. Thomas, desperate, found a fuel drum and grabbed the icy liquid inside, spreading it around. He took out the lighter he kept in his pocket. Is this a suicide or a plan? He thought. There was no time to decide. The creature approached, the temperature plummeting even further. The lighter lit. Let's see if you can resist the fire, bastard. He threw the lighter into the scattered fuel. The fire spread instantly, lighting the warehouse in flames. The creature reared back, letting out a sharp, deafening sound, almost like ice cracking. Thomas took the chance and ran back to the main room. His breathing was short and painful, but he knew the fire wouldn't last forever. Furthermore, the flames could destroy the station before completely driving the being away. He locked the storage room door and tried to think of another solution. There were external cameras connected to a secondary generator. Maybe they could record something that explained how that thing got there. Thomas crawled over to the main console and turned on the system. Images from the last 12 hours began to play on the screen. What he saw left him speechless. The camera captured the snowstorm outside, but at 3 a.m., the sky seemed torn by a flash. A shape slowly descended, landing on the ice. The creature did not come from the icy desert, but from above. This isn't human. It can't be, he thought. The gleam in the creature's eyes made sense. It was something alien, something that perhaps shouldn't even be on Earth. But before he could react, a dull knock on the door brought Thomas out of his thoughts. The humanoid was back, now furious. The door started to freeze. He could see the metal harden with a layer of thick ice. There was no time. Thomas knew he needed to escape, but the question was, where? Thomas knew he couldn't face the creature indefinitely inside the station. Even though it had supplies and tools, the creature was turning the environment into an ice trap, sucking out any remaining heat. He needed to make a quick decision. The air was so cold that his breaths turned into tiny crystals as they left his mouth. The main door began to give way. The creature hit with relentless force as the ice spread, creating cracks in the structure. Thomas ran to the supply closet and found his emergency thermal suit, along with a backpack where he stored as many essentials as possible: flashlights, batteries, the radio, and a small portable torch he used to defrost machines. If I leave here, I'll freeze to death. If I stay, this thing will catch me, he thought, quickly putting on the suit. He opened the trapdoor that led underground, an emergency tunnel used to access the radio antenna, located about 200 meters from the station. The idea was risky, but he had no other choice. Inside the tunnel, the darkness was almost absolute, except for the faint glow of the flashlight stuck to his forehead. The humanoid seemed to notice his escape, as Thomas heard a sharp sound coming from outside. It was almost like the sound of ice breaking under pressure, but with an electronic overtone. "He's hunting me," he whispered to himself, trying to control his breathing. When he reached the exit of the tunnel, he found the radio antenna. His plan was to improvise a distress signal. If someone in Anchorage picked it up, maybe they'd send help. But the moment of relief was brief. Thomas felt the temperature drop even further. As he turned, he saw the creature at the edge of the tunnel, its translucent form reflecting the light of the flashlight. Thomas backed away, stumbling in the snow. The humanoid advanced, sucking in the heat around it, turning everything into solid ice. Thomas grabbed the torch and activated it, shooting out a short, intense flame. The creature hesitated for a moment, retreating as if in pain. It was vulnerable to heat, but not enough to be defeated. It was then that Thomas noticed something. The creature seemed to avoid the sky. Whenever the horizon became visible, she slipped back into the shadows. The fire hurts her, but the sky seems to scare her. Why? She thought. With the humanoid approaching again, Thomas had a desperate idea. The radio antenna was equipped with a small, high-power transmitter. If he managed to activate the equipment, perhaps he could create a wave of intense heat or even overload the creature with a pulse of energy. The problem was that the transmitter was frozen, making it unusable by the creature. He would have to thaw it first. Just a little more time, Thomas said to himself as he adjusted the torch to melt the ice accumulated on the panel. The creature advanced, moving with surreal speed. Thomas swung the torch toward her, creating a makeshift barrier of heat. He knew it wouldn't last, but he needed to finish the job. The panel began to respond, small lights blinking as the system rebooted. Finally, he managed to activate the transmitter. The device emitted a loud sound, a rising hum that seemed to vibrate all the way to Thomas's bones. The creature hesitated, its movements becoming more erratic. Then something unexpected happened. A burst of light shot up into the sky, as if the transmitter was emitting a signal into space. The creature let out a deafening scream, retreating violently. His body began to tremble, crumbling into ice particles that floated in the air. Thomas watched, shocked, as the creature completely dissolved. The surrounding environment, however, remained unchanged, still freezing and deadly. He fell to his knees, exhausted. Everything seemed over, but a sound coming from the transmitter caught his attention. A new wave of light began to pulse, as if something was responding to the signal sent. "It can't be," Thomas whispered, looking at the sky. Suddenly, the horizon glowed with a strange greenish glow. It wasn't an aurora borealis. It was something more, something that seemed coming towards him. Thomas realized too late that the humanoid was not unique. That light was a sign of return. He had called others. Thomas stood transfixed as the green glow in the sky intensified, illuminating the frozen landscape with an otherworldly hue. His lungs felt like they were freezing as he watched. What he had unleashed was greater than anything he could comprehend. The transmitter was still emitting pulses of energy, like a beacon calling out to something. It wasn't just a creature he would face. He had opened a door to a much greater threat. The first response was visceral: run away. He gathered his things, tightened his thermal suit around his body, and began walking down the slope that led to the nearby forest. It was the only natural cover for miles, and although I knew the cold here would be relentless, it seemed like a better choice than facing the unknown again so soon. As he descended, the frozen ground crunched beneath his feet. The sound was too loud to ignore, and Thomas knew that whatever was coming could easily follow him. When he reached the first trees, he stopped, breathing hard, each exhalation turning into a mist that seemed to linger in the air too long. Then he heard it again, that deep electronic sound, like a lament. Only this time it wasn't coming from a single source. There were multiple sounds. Thomas turned to look at the mountain range in the distance. The greenish glow of the sky was now descending, a light that seemed to melt ice, creating steam that rose in great columns. And then he saw something emerge from the mist. More humanoids. 4, 5, maybe more. Each of them different, but equally frightening, with shapes that oscillated between the solid and the ethereal, as if they were ice sculptures in motion. Thomas began to run through the forest, ignoring the fatigue and the cold that was already biting his fingers through his gloves. He knew he needed to think quickly. His tools wouldn't be enough against such a large number, and the transmitter was now useless, perhaps even because of all this. I need heat. Something big, he thought, remembering what he saw at the station, the creature hesitating in front of the fire. But how do you create enough heat in the middle of a frozen forest? He kept running until he saw a rise in the forest that looked promising. It was an old gas excavation site, an abandoned well that had been closed years ago. If there was still some trace of gas there, perhaps it could create an explosion. Hope renewed his strength. He struggled through the treacherous terrain, stumbling and almost falling several times, but finally reached the location. There were old metal valves buried in the snow, covered in ice, but clearly still connected to an underground reservoir. He took the blowtorch and began to heat the valves, forcing them to turn. "Let's go! Let's go!" he shouted, as the sound of escaping gas began to emerge. Little by little, a small column of gas began to come out, invisible but audible. Thomas knew he would need to be careful. A mistimed ignition would mean his death, but he had no choice. The electronic sounds grew louder, indicating that the creatures were close. Thomas managed to pause to look around and saw one of the creatures in the distance, watching him from within the forest. She seemed to hesitate, but her eyes sparkled, tracing his every move. It was as if he was coordinating the others. The air around him grew colder, and Thomas knew he was almost out of time. With a makeshift plan, he pulled the radio from his backpack and began adjusting it to transmit static. The sound was amplified and echoed through the forest. He didn't know if it would attract the creatures or repel them, but he needed enough distraction to ignite the gas. The trick worked. Two of the creatures began to move towards the sound of the radio, while Thomas finished adjusting the blowtorch. Finally, he activated the torch and sent a spark into the gas well. For a second, nothing happened. Then a dull explosion shook the ground, and a violent heat wave spread through the forest. The light from the explosion illuminated everything, and Thomas was thrown backwards, slamming into the trunk of a tree. When he regained his vision, he saw that the creatures were retreating, screaming as their forms dissipated. One of them, the largest, seemed to struggle more than the others. Its glowing eyes focused on Thomas as if registering his image before disappearing in a whirlwind of ice and steam. Despite his success, Thomas knew this was not a victory. He dragged himself away from the burning pit, feeling exhaustion taking over. But the heat from the explosion brought a frightening revelation. The greenish glow in the sky was still there, and it seemed brighter than ever. He understood now. The creatures weren't just invaders. They were explorers. He had been the first witness to something much bigger. In the distance, he heard the electronic sound again. Weaker this time, but present. Thomas, bruised and powerless, knew he would need more than ingenuity to survive what came next. He was being hunted, not by a creature, but by an entire system that might not be able to be stopped. The forest burned silently, the heat from the explosion dancing in the freezing air like Thomas's last act of resistance. But he knew that victory was temporary. The green eyes that glowed in the sky above were the promise that something greater was on the way. He held the empty, now useless blowtorch and looked around, searching for a plan. The humanoids had retreated, but not for long. The one who seemed to be the leader, the biggest of them, had registered his presence. It wasn't just a creature, it was part of a system. Thomas finally understood what the transmitter's glow meant. He had attracted attention, not just the creatures, but something much bigger, something that controlled those beings like instruments. Staggering through the snow, he knew he needed to get back to the station. It was the only place where he had enough tools to plan a last defense, or at least send a final message. The cold was now almost unbearable, each step an effort against the numbness that threatened to take over his body. When he finally saw the station, he realized something was terribly wrong. The building was almost unrecognizable. A thick layer of ice enveloped him, covering walls, windows, and doors. The antennas were frozen, bent under the weight of the ice. But there was something more. A green pulse came from within. Thomas's heart almost stopped. That could only mean one thing. The creatures had turned the station into some kind of nexus, a connection point with whatever was in the sky. "No, no, no," he muttered, trying desperately to think of a solution. As he approached, He heard the unmistakable sound, the electronic wail of the creatures. Now he wasn't facing just one or two. There were several translucent shapes moving around the perimeter, their figures swaying like frozen shadows. They weren't just waiting, they were building something. Ice structures began to rise around the station, forming a kind of improvised antenna. Thomas knew he couldn't allow this to continue. If the creatures managed to complete what they were doing, it could be the end, not only for him, but for anything living in that region. With the blowtorch unusable and the remaining tools in his backpack, he knew he had to find another way. It was then that he remembered the emergency generator. Powered by a still full propane tank, it could be turned into an improvised bomb, but activating the generator would mean entering the station, into the creature's territory. Approaching stealthily, Thomas observed the creatures. They seemed to ignore him for now, busy with building the ice structure. He took a deep breath, gathered his courage, and moved toward the side of the station, where a service entrance was partially visible under the ice. Using a wrench, he broke off enough of the frozen layer to open the door, slipping inside before anyone saw him. The inside of the station was a nightmare. Ice covered every surface, turning the place into a glittering cave. The cold was even more intense, and Thomas's every breath felt like needles piercing his lungs. But what scared him most was the presence of the creatures. There was one, larger than the others, in the center of the main room, facing the transmitter. It seemed to feed on the energy that pulsed from there, its forms oscillating between solidity and something almost liquid. Thomas hid behind a pile of frozen boxes, holding the radio and empty blowtorch like a fool. "I need to do this quickly," he thought. He crawled to the generator, fighting the ice that was beginning to coat the surface of the propane tank. As he tried to adjust the valves, he heard the sound of movement. The larger creature was looking in his direction. For a moment he thought he had been discovered, but he realized she was looking at the empty blowtorch. The light reflected off it, confusing the creature. That gave Thomas the split second he needed. He opened the propane tank, allowing the gas to begin escaping. Pulling the wires from the generator, he improvised a short circuit, creating a spark that would be enough to activate the gas. "This has to work," he whispered. The creature finally realized what he was doing. He let out a shrill scream, and the others began to move quickly towards him. Thomas knew he only had a moment. He ran to the door, stumbling and slipping as the sound of gas grew louder. When he finally reached the outside, he turned to look. The creatures were all inside, trying to put out the generator. With a cry of despair, Thomas picked up the radio and sent a short message. "For anyone who can hear, stop it. They are..." Before he could finish, a violent explosion rocked the station. The heat was so intense that it threw Thomas into the snow, burning parts of his thermal suit. He lay there, panting, as the station disappeared in a cloud of fire and steam. When he finally opened his eyes, the sky was clear. The green glow was gone. Were the creatures dead, dissipated? He didn't know. I just felt absolute silence, as if the world itself was holding its breath, but something made him freeze in place. On the horizon, where the mountain range met the sky, a new glow began to emerge. It wasn't green this time. It was an intense red, pulsating like a beating heart. Thomas realized he wasn't finished. This was not a victory. It was just the beginning. Thomas felt his body giving in to exhaustion, but the red glow on the horizon brought a wave of adrenaline that made him stand up. The heat from the explosion had disappeared, and the deadly cold was once again taking over the environment. The silence around was absolute, but the red pulse in the sky held the promise of something greater, something more terrible. He knew the fight was far from over. His thermal suit was damaged, and his backpack was practically empty. All that was left was the radio, which was still emitting faint static. He looked at the horizon, where the red glow pulsed like a warning sign, but also at the path in front of him. An icy desert that would lead him nowhere. He needed a plan. He decided to try the radio again, adjusting the frequencies in the hope of picking up some human signal. "This is Thomas Burke, Station 17. His voice was weak but determined. "Emergency. I need help. Something is here." The answer came faster than I expected, a deep, hurried voice cutting through the static. "Station 17. This is Fox Base in Anchorage. We picked up your signal a few hours ago, but it was incomplete. We sent a team. Are you safe?" Thomas almost laughed at the irony of the question. Safe was a word that seemed to no longer be part of his reality. "No, I'm not sure. None of us are. You need to destroy this. Something is coming." "Something? What are you talking about?" the voice replied, with a tone that mixed confusion and alarm. Before he could continue, a thunderous sound reverberated across the landscape. It was the same electronic sound he had heard before, but now amplified, as if it were coming from all sides. Thomas looked at the horizon, and his heart skipped a beat. A gigantic shape emerged from the red glow, something that made humanoids seem insignificant. It was like a living tower, a structure of ice and energy that seemed to move with purpose. As it rose, the ice around it melted and then froze again, creating a surreal landscape. It was an entity, and Thomas knew there was no way to confront it. He began to run, with each step fighting against the wind and cold that threatened to knock him down. His only hope was to reach the rescue team. But the further he got from the destroyed station, the more he realized that the red glow was not just a distant manifestation. He could feel it, like a sickening heat that consumed the energy around him. As he ran, he saw what appeared to be the answer to his distress call in the sky, lights flashing in the distance, probably from a helicopter. But the distance was far, and he knew he would need to attract their attention before it was too late. Thomas started screaming, waving his hands, and trying to use the radio to emit some kind of signal. Finally, the helicopter seemed to change direction, coming towards him. But the electronic sound was growing, and he knew the entity was moving. He looked back and saw that the gigantic figure was closer, moving with a speed impossible for something so colossal. The helicopter arrived in time, landing in an open space in the snow. Two men came down, shouting to Thomas, "Come quickly!" He ran with everything he had, feeling the artificial heat of the helicopter as a promise of salvation. When he finally reached the men, one of them grabbed his arm, pulling him into the aircraft. The sound of the propellers was deafening, but Thomas could still hear the electronic sound, growing louder and louder. "We need to get out of here now," he shouted, panting. The helicopter began to take off, but as it gained altitude, Thomas looked out the window and saw the giant entity stop. There was no way something so colossal wouldn't reach the helicopter, but she seemed to watch. It was as if she was analyzing what he did, recording every movement. "Why did you stop?" he whispered to himself, while the other men looked on without understanding. And then the worst came. On the helicopter's dashboard, the radio emitted a static sound, and amidst the static, an artificial voice, cold and metallic, said, "You called me. We are here." Thomas froze. This was not a retreat. It was the beginning of something bigger. He knew with a certainty that burned in his mind that this thing, whatever it was, didn't care about him or the destroyed station. It was a slow, deliberate invasion, and he had opened the door. As the helicopter headed toward Anchorage, he looked at the other men and said, "You need to alert everyone. There's no way to fight it. They're watching us, and this was just a test." The red glow on the horizon began to fade as the helicopter moved away, but Thomas knew that this was not the end. It was just the prologue of something much bigger, something he feared no one was prepared to face. 6 months later, Anchorage was unrecognizable. The scientific base where Thomas had reported the events had been transformed into a government operations center. The area was surrounded by armed troops, drones were constantly flying overhead, and the word classified was used in every conversation. The local population had only rumors about what had happened. Unexplained explosions, temperatures that plummeted below any historical record, and mysterious lights in the sky. But no one knew the full truth, except Thomas Burke. He was in a military hospital under constant surveillance. At first, he had cooperated, answering questions from scientists and military personnel, but he soon realized that they were not interested in protecting him or the world. They wanted to understand what he had called and how they could control or use it. Sitting in his hospital bed, Thomas stared out the window, watching the snow fall. It seemed normal, but he knew it wasn't. The snowstorms had never been the same. On the horizon, he could still see the same greenish and reddish glows that haunted him in his nightmares. The lights were further away, but they had not completely disappeared. In the next room, a team of scientists discussed fervently around a monitor. Transmitter recordings at Thomas's station had revealed strange patterns. The electronic sounds were not random. They were a language. And someone, or something, seemed to be responding. "We can't ignore this, sir," said a woman, adjusting her glasses. "These creatures were not isolated. They are part of something much larger, a coordinated system." The general responsible for the project, a man with a stern, weathered face, crossed his arms. "We need more time to study before taking any action. The protocol is clear." The scientist hesitated before continuing. "General, with all due respect, they won't wait. Energy readings in the Arctic have increased tenfold since the Burke incident. It's not a question of whether they'll come back. It's a matter of when." Meanwhile, Thomas received an unexpected visitor. A man dressed in a black suit entered the room, bringing with him a cold that seemed to cut through the room. "Mr. Burke, we have some updates for you," the man said, his voice neutral and professional. "Updates?" Thomas replied sarcastically. "Are you still trying to understand how this all started? Wasn't it enough that I almost died for you to believe me?" The man ignored the comment and placed a thick file on the table next to the bed. "We have monitored similar activities in other parts of the planet, Russia, Greenland, Antarctic. The pattern is the same: extreme temperatures, ice structures appearing, and recently unexplained disappearances." Thomas looked at the file but didn't play it. "They are advancing. If we keep watching without acting, we will lose everything," he said, his voice low and tired. The man leaned forward, his face now seriously. "The question is not what we will do. That's what you will do. You were the first to survive a direct meeting. You need to help us." Thomas laughed, an empty and bitter sound. "To help? You did not understand. This cannot be overcome. Not with weapons, not with machines. This is bigger than all of us." The man stared at him for a moment before speaking. "Maybe you're right, but maybe you know something we haven't found yet." That night, Thomas woke up with a familiar sound, the same electronic lament he had heard at the station. He got up, ignoring the pain in his body, and went to the window. The horizon was lit again with a red glow, closer than ever. "It's not over," he thought. "It will never end." He knew that the ice humanoids were just scouts, exploiting something that humanity was not ready to face. They did not come only to destroy, they came to study. And somewhere in space, or in another dimension, something was watching, calculating, preparing. Thomas returned to bed, his mind taken by a single question that consumed him from the beginning. I was the one who called them. Or were they always waiting for us? What did you think of this outcome? Leave your opinion in the comments. We love to know what you think. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like to support our work. See you in the next video.